The Story of Civilization, Volume 6, The Reformation, by Will Durant. Part 1, Continued, Cassette 2, Side 2. On June 11th, Tyler turned his army toward London. At Maidstone, it delivered John Ball from jail. He joined the cavalcade and preached to it every day. Now, he said, would begin that reign of Christian democracy which he had so long dreamed of and pled for. All social inequalities would be leveled. There would no longer be rich and poor, lords and serfs. Every man would be a king. Meanwhile, related uprisings occurred in Norfolk, Suffolk, Beverley, Bridgewater, Cambridge, Essex, Middlesex, Sussex, Hertford, Somerset. At Bury St. Edmund, the people cut off the head of the prior, who had too stoutly asserted the feudal rights of the abbey over the town. At Colchester, the rioters killed several Florentine merchants who were believed to be cutting in on British trade. Wherever possible, they destroyed the rolls, leases, or charters that recorded feudal ownership or bondage. Hence, the townsfolk of Cambridge burned the charters of the university. And at Waltham, every document in the abbey archives was committed to the flames. On June 11th, the rebel army from Essex and Hertford approached the northern outskirts of London. On the 12th, the Kent insurgents reached Southwark, just across the Thames. No organized resistance was offered by the adherents of the king. Richard II, Sudbury, and Hales hid in the Tower. Tyler sent the king a request for an interview. It was refused. The mayor of London, William Walworth, closed the city gates, but they were reopened by revolutionists within the town. On June 13th, the Kent forces marched into the capital, were welcomed by the people, and were joined by thousands of laborers. Tyler held his host fairly well in leash, but appeased its fury by allowing it to sack the palace of John of Gaunt. Nothing was stolen there. One rioter who tried to filch a silver goblet was killed by the crowd. But everything was destroyed. Costly furniture was thrown out of the windows, rich hangings were torn to rags, jewelry was smashed to bits. Then the house was burned to the ground, and some jolly rebels who had drunk themselves to stupor in the wine cellar were forgotten and consumed in the flames. Thereafter the army turned on the Temple, citadel of the lawyers of England. The peasants remembered that lawyers had written the deeds of their servitude, or had assessed their holdings for taxation. There, too, they made a holocaust of the records and burned the buildings to the ground. The jails in Newgate and the Fleet were destroyed, and the happy inmates joined the mob. Wearied with its efforts to crowd a century of revenge into a day, the multitudes lay down in the open spaces of the city and slept. That evening the King's Council thought better of its refusal to let him talk with Tyler. They sent an invitation to Tyler and his followers to meet with Richard the next morning at a northern suburb known as Mile End. Shortly after dawn on June 14th, the 14-year-old king, risking his life, rode out of the Tower with all of his council except Sudbury and Hales, who dared not expose themselves. The little party made its way through the hostile crowd to Mile End, where the Essex rebels were already gathered. Part of the Kent army followed, with Tyler at its head. He was surprised at the readiness of Richard to grant nearly all demands. Serfdom was to be abolished throughout England, all feudal dues and services were to end, the rental of the tenants would be as they had asked, and a general amnesty would absolve all those who had shared in the revolt. 30 clerks were at once sent to work drawing up charters of freedom and forgiveness for all districts that applied. One demand the king refused, that the royal ministers and other traitors should be surrendered to the people. Richard replied that all persons accused of misconduct in government would be tried by orderly process of law, and would be punished if found guilty. Not satisfied with this answer, Tyler and a selected band rode rapidly to the Tower. They found Sudbury singing Mass in the chapel. They dragged him out into the courtyard and forced him down with his neck on a log. The executioner was an amateur and required 8 strokes of the axe to sever the head. The insurgents then beheaded Hales and 2 others. Upon the archbishop's head, they fixed his mitre firmly with a nail driven into the skull. They mounted the heads on pikes, carried them in procession through the city, and set them up over the gate of London Bridge. All the remainder of that day was spent in slaughter. London tradesmen, resenting Flemish competition, bade the crowd kill every Fleming found in the capital. To determine the nationality of a suspect, he was shown bread and cheese and bidden name them. If he answered brood and käse, or spoke with a Flemish brogue, he forfeited his life. Over 150 aliens, merchants and bankers, were slain in London on that day in June, and many English lawyers, tax collectors, and adherents of John of Gaunt fell under the axes and hatchets of indiscriminate vengeance. Apprentices murdered their masters, debtors their creditors. At midnight the sated victors again retired to rest. Informed of these events, the king returned from Mile End and went not to the Tower but to his mother's rooms near St. Paul's. Meanwhile, a large number of the Essex and Hertford contingents, rejoicing in their charters of freedom, dispersed toward their homes. On June 15th, the king sent a modest message to the remaining rebels asking them to meet him in the open spaces of Smithfield outside Aldersgate. Tyler agreed. Before keeping this rendezvous, Richard, fearing death, confessed and took the sacrament. Then he rode out with a retinue of 200 men whose peaceful garb hid swords. At Smithfield, Tyler came forward with only a single companion to guard him. He made new demands, uncertainly reported, but apparently including the confiscation of church property and the distribution of the proceeds among the people. A dispute ensued. One of the king's escort called Tyler a thief. Tyler directed his aide to strike the man down. Mayor Walworth blocked the way. Tyler stabbed at Walworth, whose life was saved by the armor under his cloak. Walworth wounded Tyler with a short cutlass, and one of Richard's squires ran Tyler through twice with a sword. Tyler rode back to his host crying treason, and fell dead at their feet. Shocked by what seemed to them plain treachery, the rebels set their arrows and prepared to shoot. Though their numbers were reduced, they were still a substantial force, reckoned by Froissart at 20,000. Probably they could have overwhelmed the king's retinue. But Richard now rode out bravely toward them, crying out, "Sirs, will you shoot your king? I will be your chief and captain. You shall have from me that which you seek. Only follow me into the fields without." He rode out slowly, not sure that they would heed or spare him. The insurgents hesitated, then followed him, and most of the royal guard mingled in their midst. Walworth, however, turned sharply back, galloped into the city, and sent orders to the aldermen of its 24 wards to join him with all the armed forces they could muster. Many citizens who had at first sympathized with the revolt were now disturbed by the murders and pillage. Every man who had any property felt his goods and his life to be in peril. So the mayor found an impromptu army of 7,000 men rising at his command, as if out of the earth. These he led back to Smithfield. There he rejoined and surrounded the king, and offered to massacre the rebels. Richard refused. The rebels had spared him when he was at their mercy, and he would not now show himself less generous. He announced to them that they were free to depart in safety. The Essex and Hertford remnants rapidly melted away. The London mutineers disappeared into their haunts. Only the Kent contingent stayed. Their passage through the city was blocked by Walworth's armed men, but Richard ordered that no one should molest them. They marched off in safety and filed back in disorder along the old Kent road. The king returned to his mother, who greeted him with tears of happy relief. "Ah, fair son, what pain and anguish have I had for you this day?" "Certes, madam," the boy answered, "I know it well, but now rejoice and praise God, for today I have recovered my heritage that was lost, and the realm of England too." Probably under the prodding of the mayor who had saved him, Richard, on that same June 15th, issued a proclamation banishing from London, on pain of death, all persons who had not lived there for a year past. Walworth and his troops searched streets and tenements for such aliens, caught many, killed several. Among these was one Jack Straw, who confessed, presumably under torture, that the men of Kent had planned to make Tyler king. In the meantime, a deputation from the Essex insurgents arrived at Waltham, and demanded of the king a formal ratification of the promises he had made on June 14th. Richard replied that these had been made under duress, and that he had no intention of keeping them. On the contrary, he told them, "Villains you are still, and villains you shall remain." And he threatened dread vengeance on any man who continued in armed rebellion. The angry deputies called upon their followers to renew the revolt. Some did, but these were cut down with great slaughter by Walworth's men on June 28th. On July 2nd, the embittered king revoked all charters and amnesties granted by him during the outbreak, and opened the way to a judicial inquiry into the identity and actions of the main participants. Hundreds were arrested and tried. 110 or more were put to death. John Ball was caught at Coventry. He fearlessly avowed his leading role in the insurrection and refused to ask pardon of the king. He was hanged, drawn, and quartered, and his head, with those of Tyler and Jack Straw, replaced those of Sudbury and Hales as adornments of London Bridge. On November 13th, Richard laid before Parliament an account of his actions. If, he said, the assembled prelates and lords and commons wished the serfs to be freed, he was quite willing. But the members were nearly all landowners. They could not admit the right of the king to dispose of their property. They voted that all existing feudal relations should be maintained. The beaten peasants returned to their ploughs, the sullen workers to their looms. 4. The new literature. The English language was becoming by slow stages a fit vehicle for literature. The Norman invasion of 1066 had stopped the evolution of Anglo-Saxon into English, and for a time French was the official language of the realm. Gradually, a new vocabulary and idiom formed, basically Germanic but mingled and adorned with Gallic words and turns. The long war with France may have spurred the nation to rebel against this linguistic domination by an enemy. In 1362, English was declared to be the language of law in the courts, and in 1363, the Chancellor set a precedent by opening Parliament with an English address. Scholars, chroniclers, and philosophers, even till Francis Bacon, continued to write in Latin to reach an international audience, but poets and dramatists, henceforth, spoke the speech of England. The oldest drama extant in English was a mystery, a dramatic representation of a religious story, performed in the Midlands about 1350 under the title of The Harrowing of Hell, which staged a duel in words at the mouth of hell between Satan and Christ. In the 14th century it became customary for the guilds of a town to present a cycle of mysteries. A guild would prepare a scene, usually from the Bible, carry the setting and the actors on a float, and act the scenes on temporary stages built at populous centers in the city. And on successive days other guilds would present later scenes from the same biblical narrative. The earliest such cycle now known is that of the Chester Mysteries of 1328. By 1400 similar cycles were presented in York, Beverley, Cambridge, Coventry, Wakefield, Townley, and London. As early as 1182, the Latin mysteries had developed a variety called the miracle, centering around the miracle or sufferings of some saint. About 1378, another variety appeared, the morality, which pointed a moral by acting a tale. This form would reach its peak in Everyman, circa 1480. Early in the 15th century, we hear of still another dramatic form, doubtless then already old, the interlude, not a play between plays, but a ludus, a play or show carried on between two or more actors. Its subject was not restricted to religion or morality, but might be secular, humorous, profane, even obscene. Minstrel troupes played interludes in baronial or guild halls, in town or village squares, or in the courtyard of a frequented inn. In 1348, Exeter raised the first known English theatre, the first European building, since classic Roman structures specifically and regularly devoted to dramatic representations. From the interludes would evolve the comedies, and from the mysteries and moralities would develop the tragedies of the lusty Elizabethan stage. The first major poem, one of the strangest and strongest poems in the English language, called itself The Vision of William Concerning Piers the Ploughman. Nothing is known of the author except through his poem. Assuming that this is autobiographical, we may name him William Langland and place his birth near 1332. He took minor orders, but never became a priest. He wandered to London and earned something short of starvation by singing psalms at masses for the dead. He lived dissolutely, sinned with covetousness of eyes and concupiscence of the flesh, had a daughter, perhaps married her mother, and dwelled with them in a hovel in Cornhill. He describes himself as a tall, gaunt figure, dressed in a sombre robe befitting the grey disillusionment of his hopes. He was fond of his poem, issued it thrice, in 1362, 1377, and 1394, and each time spun it out to greater length. Like the Anglo-Saxon poets, he used no rhyme, but alliterative verse of irregular metre. He begins by picturing himself as falling asleep on a Malvern hill, and seeing in a dream a field full of folk, multitudes of rich, poor, good, bad, young, old, and amid them a fair and noble lady whom he identifies with Holy Church. He kneels before her and begs for no treasure, but tell me how I may save my soul. She replies, When all treasures are tried, truth is best. Whoso is true of his tongue and telleth naught but that, and doeth the works therewith, and willeth no man ill, he is a god by the gospel, and like to our Lord. In a second dream he visions the 7 deadly sins, and under each head he indicts the wickedness of man in a powerful satire. For a time he abandons himself to cynical pessimism, awaiting an early end of the world. Then Piers, or Peter the Ploughman, enters the poem. He is a model farmer, honest, friendly, generous, trusted by all, working hard, living faithfully with his wife and children, and always a pious son of the Church. In later visions, William sees the same Piers as the human Christ, as Peter the Apostle, as a pope, then as vanishing in the papal schism and the advent of Antichrist. The clergy, says the poet, are no longer a saving remnant. Many of them have become corrupt. They deceive the simple, absolve the rich for a consideration, traffic in sacred things, sell heaven itself for a coin. What is a Christian to do in such a universal debacle? He must, says William, go forth again over all intervening institutions and corruptions, and seek the living Christ himself. Piers the Ploughman contains its quota of nonsense, and its obscure allegories weary any reader who lays upon authors the moral obligation to be clear. But it is a sincere poem, plays rascals impartially, pictures the human scene vividly, rises through touches of feeling and beauty to a place second only to the Canterbury Tales in the English literature of the 14th century. Its influence was remarkable. Piers became for the rebels of England a symbol of the righteous, fearless peasant. John Ball recommended him to the Essex insurgents of 1381. As late as the Reformation, his name was invoked in criticizing the old religious order and demanding a new. In ending his visions, the poet returned from Piers the Pope to Piers again the peasant. If all of us, he concluded, were like Piers, simple, practicing Christians, that would be the greatest, the final revolution. No other would ever be needed. John Gower is a less romantic poet and figure than the mysterious Langland. He was a rich landowner of Kent who imbibed too much scholastic erudition and achieved dullness in 3 languages. He, too, attacked the faults of the clergy, but he trembled at the heresies of the Lollards and marveled at the insolence of peasants who, once content with beer and corn, now demanded meat and milk and cheese. 3 things, said Gower, are merciless when they get out of hand: water, fire, and the mob. Disgusted with this world, worried about the next, moral Gower retired in old age to a priory and spent his closing year in blindness and prayer. His contemporaries admired his morals, regretted his temper and his style, and turned with relief to Chaucer. 5. Geoffrey Chaucer, 1340 to 1400. He was a man full of the blood and beer of merry England, capable of taking in his stride the natural difficulties of life, drawing their sting with a forgiving humor, and picturing all phases of the English scene with a brush as broad as Homer's, a spirit as lusty as Rabelais'. His name, like so much of his language, was of French origin. It meant shoemaker, and probably was pronounced chausser. Posterity plays tricks with our very names and remembers us only to remake us to its whim. He was the son of John Chaucer, a London vintner. He won a good education from both books and life. His poetry abounds in knowledge of men and women, literature and history. In 1357, Geoffrey Chaucer was officially listed in the service of the household of the future Duke of Clarence. 2 years later, he was off to the wars in France. He was captured, but was freed for a ransom, to which Edward III contributed. In 1367, we find him a yeoman of the king's chamber, with a life pension of 20 marks, or about $1,333 a year. Edward traveled much with his household at his heels. Presumably, Chaucer accompanied him, savoring England as he went. In 1366, he married Philippa, a lady serving the Queen, and lived with her in moderate discord till her death. Richard II continued the pension, and John of Gaunt added £10, or about $1,000, annually. There were other aristocratic gifts, which may explain why Chaucer, who saw so much of life, took little notice of the Great Revolt. It was a pleasant custom of those days, which admired poetry and eloquence, to send men of letters on diplomatic missions abroad. So Chaucer was deputed with 2 others to negotiate a trade agreement at Genoa in 1372. And in 1378 he went with Sir Edward Berkeley to Milan. Who knows but he may have met ailing Boccaccio, aging Petrarch. In any case, Italy was a transforming revelation to him. He saw there a culture far more polished, lettered, and subtle than England's. He learned a new reverence for the classics, at least the Latin. The French influence that had molded his early poems yielded now to Italian ideas, verse forms, and themes. When finally he turned to his own land for his scenes and characters, he was an accomplished artist and a mature mind. No man could then live in England by writing poetry. We might have supposed that Chaucer's pensions would keep him adequately housed, fed, and clad. After 1378, they totaled some $10,000 in the money of our time. Besides, his wife enjoyed her own pensions from John of Gaunt and the king. In any case, Chaucer felt a need to supplement his income by taking various governmental posts. For 12 years, from 1374 to 1386, he served as Controller of the Customs and Subsidies, and during that time he occupied lodgings over the Aldgate Tower. In 1380 he paid an unstated sum to Cecilia Champagne for withdrawing her suit against him for rape. 5 years later he was appointed Justice of the Peace for Kent, and in 1386 he had himself elected to Parliament. It was in the intervals of these labors that he wrote his poetry. He describes himself in the House of Fame as hurrying home after he had made his reckonings and losing himself in his books, sitting dumb as a stone and living like a hermit in all but poverty, chastity, and obedience, and setting his wit to make books, songs, and ditties in rhyme. In his youth, he tells us, he had written many a song and lecherous lay. He translated Boethius's The Consolation of Philosophy into good prose, and part of Guillaume de Lorris's Roman de la Rose into excellent verse. He began a number of what may be called major-minor poems: The House of Fame, The Book of the Duchess, The Parliament of Fowls, and The Legend of Good Women. He anticipated us in being unable to finish them. They were ambitious yet timid tentatives, frank imitations, in theme and form, of continental origins. In his finest single poem, Troilus and Cressida, he continued to imitate, even to translate. But to 2,730 lines that he lifted from Boccaccio's Philostrato, he added 5,696 lines of other provenance, or coined in his own mint. He made no attempt to deceive. He repeatedly referred to his source and apologized for not translating at all. Such transfers from one literature to another were considered legitimate and useful, for even well-educated men could not then understand any vernacular but their own. Plots, as Greek and Elizabethan dramatists felt, were common property. Art lay in the form. Despite all discounts, Chaucer's Troilus is the first great narrative poem in English. Scott called it long and somewhat dull, which it is. Rossetti called it perhaps the most beautiful narrative poem of considerable length in the English language, and this too is true. All long poems, however beautiful, become dull. Passion is of poetry's essence, and a passion that runs to 8,386 lines becomes prose almost as rapidly as desire consummated. Never were so many lines required to bring a lady to bed, and seldom has love hesitated, meditated, procrastinated, and capitulated with such magnificent and irrelevant rhetoric, and melodious conceits, and facile felicity of rhyme. Only Richardson's Mississippi of prose could rival this Nile of verse in the leisurely psychology of love. Yet even the heavy-winged oratory, the infinite wordiness, the obstructive erudition obstinately displayed, failed to destroy the poem. It is, after all, a philosophic tale of how woman is designed for love, and will soon love B if A stays too long away. It has one character livingly portrayed, Pandarus, who in the Iliad is the leader of the Lycian army in Troy, but here becomes the exuberant, resourceful, undiscourageable go-between to guide the lovers to their sin, and thereby hangs a word. Troilus is a warrior absorbed in repelling the Greeks, and scornful of men who, dallying on soft bosoms, become the thralls of appetite. He falls deliriously in love with Cressida at first sight, and thereafter thinks of nothing else but her beauty, modesty, gentleness, and grace. Cressida, after waiting anxiously through 6,000 lines for this timid soldier to announce his love, falls with relief into his arms, and Troilus forgets two worlds at once. All other dreads were and from him fled, both of the siege and his salvation. Having exhausted himself in achieving this ecstasy, Chaucer hurries over the bliss of the lovers to the tragedy that rescues it from boredom. Cressida's father having deserted to the Greeks, she is sent to them by the angry Trojans in exchange for the captured Antenor. The broken-hearted lovers part with vows of everlasting fidelity. Arriving among the Greeks, Cressida is awarded to Diomedes, whose handsome virility so captivates his captive that, qual plum invento, she surrenders in a page what before had been hoarded through a book. Perceiving which, Troilus plunges into battle seeking Diomedes, and finds death on Achilles' spear. Chaucer ended his amorous epic with a pious prayer to the Trinity, and sent it, conscience-stricken, to moral Gower to correct of your benignity. Probably in 1387, he began the Canterbury Tales. It was a brilliant scheme. To join a varied group of Britons at the Tabard Inn in Southwark, where Chaucer himself had emptied many a tankard of ale, ride with them on their vacation pilgrimage to the shrine of Becket at Canterbury, and put into their mouths the tales and thoughts that had gathered in the travelled poet's head through half a century. Such devices for stitching stories together had been used many times before, but this was the best of all. Boccaccio had assembled for his Decameron only one class of men and women. He had not made them stand out as diverse personalities. Chaucer created an inn full of characters so heterogeneously real that they seem truer to English life than the stuffed figures of history. They live and very literally move. They love and hate, laugh and cry. And as they jog along the road, we hear not only the tales they tell, but their own troubles, quarrels, and philosophies. Who will protest at quoting once more those spring-fresh opening lines? When that April with his showers sweet the drought of March hath pierced to the root, and bathed every vine in sweet liquor, of which virtue engendered is the flower. When Zephyrus eke with his sweet breath inspired hath in every holt and heath the tender crops, and the young sun hath in the ram his half-course run, and small fowls make melody that sleepen all the night with open eye, then longen folk to go on pilgrimages, to fern hollows, couth and sundry lawns. In Southwark at the Tabard, as I lay ready to wenden on my pilgrimage to Canterbury with full devout courage, at night was come into that hostelry well 29 in a company of sundry folk, by adventure folly and fellowship, and pilgrims were they all, that toward Canterbury would ride. Then one after another, Chaucer introduces them in the quaint sketches of his incomparable prologue. A knight there was, and that a worthy man, that from the time when he first began to ride out he loved chivalry, truth and honor, freedom and courtesy. At mortal battles had he been 15, and foughten for our faith at Tramesine. And though that he were worthy, he was wise, and of his port as meek as is a maid. He never yet no villainy said in all his life, unto no manner wight. He was a very parfit gentle knight. And the knight's son, a young squire, a lover, and a lusty bachelor. So hot he loved that by night or tale he slept no more than doth a nightingale. And a yeoman to serve the knight and the squire, and a most charming prioress. There was also a nun, a prioress, that of her smiling was full simple and coy. Her greatest oath was by Saint Loy, and she was clept Madam Eglantine. Full well she sung the service divine, and tuned in her nose full seemly. She was so charitable and piteous, she would weep if that she saw a mouse caught in a trap, if it were dead or bled. Of small hounds had she, that she fed with roasted flesh or milk and wastel bread. But sore weep she if one of him were dead. Of small coral about her arm she bare a pair of beads, gowded all with green, and thereon hung a brooch of gold full sheen, on which there was first a crowned A, and after, Amor vincit omnia. Add another nun, 3 priests, a jolly monk that loved venery, that is, hunting, and a friar unmatched in squeezing contributions out of pious purses. For though a widow had not a shoe, so pleasant in his in principio, yet would he have a farthing ere he went. Chaucer likes better the young student of philosophy. A clerk there was of Oxenford also, that unto logic had long ago. As lean was his horse as is a rake, and he was not right fat, I undertake, but looked hollow, and thereto soberly. Full threadbare was his overest courtepy, for he had getten him yet no benefice, nay was so worldly for to have office. For him was liever have at his bed's head 20 books, clad in black or red, of Aristotle and his philosophy, than robes rich, or filthful, or gay sultry. Of study took he most cure and most heed, not a word spake he more than was need. Sounding in mortal virtue was his speech, and gladly would he learn and gladly teach. There was also a wife of Bath, of whom more anon, and a poor parson, rich of holy thought and work, and a ploughman, and a miller, who had on the top of his nose a wart, and thereon stood a tuft of hairs red as the bristles of a sow's ears, and a monciple, or buyer for an inn or a college, a reeve, or overseer for a manor, and a sumner, or server of summonses. He was a gentle harlot, rogue, and a kind. A better fellow should men not find. He would suffer for a quart of wine a good fellow to have his concubine a 12-month and excuse him at full. With him rode a gentle pardoner, his wallet lay before him in his lap, brimful of pardons come from Rome all hot. And there was a merchant and a man of laws, a franklin or freeholder, a carpenter, a weaver, a dyer, a tapier or upholsterer, a cook, and a shipman. And there was Geoffrey Chaucer himself, standing shyly aside, large, fat, and difficult to embrace, and looking forever upon the ground as if to find a hare. And not least was mine host, owner of the Tabard Inn, who vows he has never entertained so merry a company. Indeed, he offers to go with them and be their guide, and he suggests, to pass the 56 miles away, that each of the pilgrims shall tell 2 tales going and 2 on the return, and that he who tells the best shall have a supper at our aller cost, a supper at the general expense, when they reach the inn again. It is agreed. The moving scene of this comédie humaine is set. The pilgrimage begins, and the courtly knight tells the first story, of how 2 dear friends, Palamon and Arcite, see a lass gathering flowers in a garden, fall equally in love with her, and contend in a fatal joust for her as the complacent prize. Who would believe that so romantic a pen could turn in a line from this chivalric fustian to the scatophilic obscenity of the miller's tale? But the miller has been drinking, and foresees that his mind and tongue will slip to their wonted plane. Chaucer apologizes for him and himself. He must report matters honestly, and he invites the chaste reader to skip to some story that toucheth gentleness, morality, and holiness. The prioress's tale begins on a sweetly religious note, then recounts the bitter legend of a Christian boy supposedly slain by a Jew, and how the provost of the town dutifully arrested its Jews and tortured a number of them to death. From such piety, Chaucer passes, in the prologue to the pardoner's tale, to a sharp satire on relic-mongering peddlers of indulgences. This theme will be centuries old when Luther trumpets it to the world. Then, in the prologue to the Wife of Bath's tale, our poet reaches the nadir of his morals and the zenith of his power. It is a riotous protest against virginity and celibacy, put into the bawdy mouth of an expert on matrimony, a woman who has had 5 husbands since she was 12 years of age, has buried 4 of them, and looks forward to a 6th to assuage her youth. God bade us for to wax and multiply, but of no number mention made he, of bigamy or of octogamy. Why should men speak of it villainly? Lo, here the wise king, Lord Solomon, I trow he had wives more than one, as would God, it leeful were to me to be refreshed half so often as he. Alas, alas, that ever love was sin. We shall not quote her physiological confessions, nor their masculine counterpart in the Sumner's Tale, wherein Chaucer stoops to study the anatomy of flatulence. The air is cleared when we come to the fable of the ever-obedient Griselda in the Oxford Cleric's Tale. Neither Boccaccio nor Petrarch had told so well this legend dreamed by some harassed male. Of the 58 stories promised in the prologue, Chaucer gives us only 23. Perhaps he felt with the reader that 500 pages were enough, and that the well of his inventiveness had run dry. Even in this bubbling stream there are muddy passages, which the judicious eye will overleap. Nevertheless, the slow, deep current carries us buoyantly along and gives forth an air of freshness, as if the poet had lived along green banks rather than over a London gate, though there, too, the Thames was not far to seek. Some of the paeans to outdoor beauty are stereotyped literary exercises, yet the moving picture comes alive with such naturalness and directness of feeling and speech, such revealing first-hand observation of men and manners as rarely may be found between the covers of one book, and such a cornucopia of images, similes, and metaphors as only Shakespeare would again provide. The pardoner mounts the pulpit, nods east and west upon the congregation like a dove on a barn gable. The East Midland dialect that Chaucer used became through him the literary language of England, a vocabulary already rich enough to express all graces and subtleties of thought. Now, for the first time, the speech of the English people became the vehicle of great literary art. The material, as in Shakespeare, is mostly second-hand. Chaucer took his stories anywhere. The Knight's Tale from Boccaccio's Teseida, Griselda from the Decameron, and a dozen from the French Fabliaux. The last source may explain some of Chaucer's obscenity. However, the most fetid of his tales has no known source but himself. Doubtless he held, with the Elizabethan dramatists, that the groundlings must be given a bawdy sop now and then to keep them awake. He made his men and women talk as matched their rank and way of life. Besides, he repeats, they had drunk much cheap ale. For the most part his humor is healthy, the hearty, lusty, full-bodied humor of well-fed Englishmen before the Puritan desiccation, marvelously mixed with the sly subtlety of modern British wit. Chaucer knew the faults, sins, crimes, follies, and vanities of mankind, but he loved life despite them, and could put up with anybody who did not sell bunkum too dearly. He seldom denounces, he merely describes. He satirizes the women of the lower middle classes in The Wife of Bath, but he relishes her biological exuberance. He is ungallantly severe on women. His mordant quips and slurs reveal the wounded husband revenging with his pen the nightly defeats of his tongue. Yet he speaks tenderly of love, reckons no other boon so rich, and fills a gallery with portraits of good women. He rejects the gentility that rested on birth, and calls only him gentle that doth gentle deeds. But he distrusts the fickleness of the commons, and counts any man a fool who hitches his fortunes to popularity or mingles with a mob. He was largely free from the superstitions of his time. He exposed the impostures of alchemists, and though some of his storytellers bring in astrology, he himself rejected it. He wrote for his son a treatise on the astrolabe, showing a good grasp of current astronomic lore. He was not a very learned man, for he liked to display his learning. He swells his pages with large patches of Boethius, and makes even The Wife of Bath quote Seneca. He mentions some problems of philosophy and theology, but shrugs his shoulders at them helplessly. Perhaps he felt, like any man of the world, that a prudent philosopher will not wear his metaphysics on his sleeve. Was he a believing Christian? Nothing could exceed the ruthlessness and coarseness of his satire on the friars in the prologue and the body of the Sumner's Tale. Such darts, however, had more than once been aimed at the brothers by men of orthodox piety. Here and there he raises a doubt of some religious dogma. No more than Luther could he harmonize divine foreknowledge with man's free will. He makes Troilus expound determinism, but in an epilogue he rejects it. He affirms his belief in heaven and hell, but notes at some length that those are bournes from which no attesting traveler returns. He is disturbed by evils apparently irreconcilable with an omnipotent benevolence, and makes Arcite question the justice of the gods with reproaches as bold as Omar Khayyam's. O cruel gods, that govern this world with binding of your word etern, and written in the table of adamant your parliament, and your etern grant, what is mankind more unto your hold than is the sheep that rouketh in the fold? For slain is man right as another beast, and dwelleth eke in prison and arrest, and hath sickness and great adversity, and oft times guiltyless pardie. What governance is in this prescience, that guiltiness tormenteth innocence? And when a beast is dead, he hath no pain, but man, after his death, must weep and plain. The answer of this I leave to divines. In later years he tried to recapture the piety of his youth. To the unfinished Canterbury Tales he appended a Presse de Chaucer, or prayer of Chaucer, begging forgiveness from God and man for his obscenities and worldly vanities, and proposing, unto my life's end, to bewail my guilts and to study to the salvation of my soul. In those last years his joy in life yielded to the melancholy of a man who, in the decay of health and sense, recalls the carefree lustiness of youth. In 1381 he was appointed by Richard II clerk of our works at our Palace of Westminster and other royal residences. 10 years later, though he was little more than 50, his health seems to have broken down. In any case, his tasks proved too much for his strength, and he was relieved of his office. We do not find him in any later employment. His finances failed, and he was reduced to asking the king for 6 shillings 8 pence. In 1394, Richard granted him a pension of £20 a year for life. It was not enough. He asked the king for a yearly hogshead of wine and received it in 1398, and when in that year he was sued for a debt of £14, he could not pay it. He died on October 25, 1400, and was buried in Westminster Abbey, the first and greatest of the many poets who there again bear the beat of measured feet. 6. Richard II. For God's sake, let us sit upon the ground and tell sad stories of the death of kings. Richard II, says Holinshead, was seemly of shape and favour, and of nature good enough, if the wickedness and naughty demeanour of such as were about him had not altered it. He was prodigal, ambitious, and much given to pleasure of the body. This book is continued on Cassette 3, Side 1.